first question is, what are some of the ways you can reward engaged users?
Lauren, why don't you take that one?
So there's a lot of different ways you can reward engaged users. I mean, you could start with something as simple as let's say someone writes a great blog post. You could feature their blog post on your community, and you could just kind of say, hey, this person has some great ideas here, and just call that to the forefront. You could do that also in maybe a newsletter. Like if someone comes up with something that's pretty interesting, you can promote that on their behalf. Something else you could do that might be valuable is, let's say at the end of the year, you've been running your community for a year. At the end of the year, you could email people who have done really wonderful, who have done some wonderful things in the community, and you could just give them a quick little high five, like, hey, you've been an awesome member, really value your participation, here's a virtual high five. You could send them a, let's say you have a t-shirt, you could send them a t-shirt. I mean, I could talk about this for 20 minutes, so I'll try to be concise, but essentially, you could reward them either with something like just a pat on the back, or you could promote them in front of other people, or you could send them something virtually, or you can invite them out for a beer if they're in the neighborhood, whatever it could be. Anything you'd really do in real life, you can kind of just take the same, model in your community.
Okay. Oh, sorry. If you had anything else to add to that, Joseph.
I think Lauren covered it really well. I would just let folks know that acknowledgement is really important. We get a lot of feedback, especially on Neighbors for Neighbors. Somebody posts like a very thoughtful blog post and they don't get comments. The same thing happens sometimes on Govloop. And what we've actually figured out is that sometimes things that are really thoughtful are very intimidating to people. And they don't always want to respond because they're afraid their response won't be up to par. So even sometimes a simple comment is really important. Like, hey, this is an amazing post. Thanks, it really made me think. Is acknowledgement, and that really helps people feel good. And then when people help you out, it's incredibly important to say thank you. It's really basic, but say thanks, and say thanks all the time, and tell people what you appreciate of it.
Great. All right, so one of my favorite students has asked, so he said, based on what you were all saying before, you don't make assumptions, but he brought up the point, don't you need to initially make some assumptions about your audience and members?
Sure, absolutely. Like, you have to have a hypothesis and a thesis and, work it and see if you're right or wrong, and I think inclination is really important, but the idea here is check your inclination, right? Do the work, do the research, vet it, and make sure that you're right. Because assuming it's obviously brilliant, you just need to check yourself.
Cool.
And I can just add something to that. I was thinking about that same exact question earlier today, just because what he said makes perfect sense. But in the beginning, if you have a core group of people that are going to help you sort of launch the community, or at least don't think your idea is totally crazy, then you could just ask them, what would motivate you to X, Y, Z? So maybe you could start with a small sample of people that you trust, and just ask them. So that might at first help kind of decrease the amount of assumptions.
Cool. Okay. Next question is, what do you do if you see regular site traffic but no comments?
I'll take that one. So regular site traffic, I first, regular site traffic, Google Analytics, so you're looking at that. I think it's really important to look at what content people are looking at, where they're entering and where they're exiting. You can actually get some really cool insights from that. So if people are coming into page A, B, and C, but you're only blogging about D content, people may not be interested, right? So there's a number of reasons why that might be. But let's say you're really focused on D content and you don't care about A, B, or C. Sometimes how you write blog posts really has a lot to do with how people comment, right? So often short, to the point blog posts where you ask questions are going to see much higher interaction or engagement than blog posts that are poorly written. That's obvious. And also, it has a lot to do with culture sometimes, and community culture is really important to think about, and we think of that in terms of norms and rituals. And as you're building your community and as you're growing your community, it's important to involve people at first in identifying what those norms and rituals are going to be, get buy-ins and get champions around those concepts, and then remind folks over time. Hey, this is what we decided to do as a community. It's really important that we honor the integrity of the design that we've all agreed on.
Cool. Great. Lauren, did you have anything to add to that?
I was just gonna say, mix up the type of content. So if you're blogging, if there are a lot of blogs that are on something very topical, like in government, it could be a potential pay freeze. So if you have a lot of blogs like that, and they might have a high barrier to entry, like someone doesn't really want to look stupid in front of the community, or they're just not really sure what to say, you could ask something very simple like, what are you doing for Thanksgiving? And in that regard, people, like most people, have an answer for that. So it helps people who are a little bit reluctant to kind of jump in the pool. They can dip their toe in, and it's not as threatening for them.
Yeah, it's like if your content's dry and it sucks, or it's too serious all the time, people are like, no thanks. I'd rather watch Family Guy or whatever. So you have to use. Actually, yesterday we went to an event. We were hearing Clay Shirky speak. Lauren Modeen's hero, by the way. They were giving examples of how people are using humor. Humor is really important. It's got to be authentic. It's got to sound like it's coming from a human being. It can't sound like it's coming from Maya Quimby on behalf of the great city of whatever. No one's gonna listen. Nobody really cares, right? So it's got to be real. It's got to be cool, and people got to be into it, right? So you got to kind of create that vibe.
Great. All right, so we've got one last question. It is, can taking conversations to Twitter or Facebook harm internal engagement?
Lauren, do you mind if I take a stab at that, or?
Sure, go for it.
So I say no. Community has its own mind and its own kind of will, and it's like a river, right? You can't control a river. If you try to control a river, it's just going to do whatever the hell it wants anyway. So you kind of have to be flexible and adapt. I think of Twitter as sort of like an extension of the community. It's like a more publicly visible. It actually gives access to the community, right? So it's like having a great party inside like a soundproof warehouse. No one's going to hear it as they walk by, right? So Twitter's like a way for your bass and your banging beats to be heard out and about, so folks can hear it and want to join, right? And so sometimes the way to take advantage of that is make sure folks are using or introduce appropriate hashtags, right? And then put links back to the community. But you don't want to use a Twitter conversation as a direct way to drive people down. But you can seed or plant content that you share back on Twitter, and it will drive people back down to your site. So you want to think about what those roles are. So if I wrote a big blog post this weekend, and I shared it on Govloop, and we tweeted it out, and it sent traffic back down to the site, and a couple folks commented from there. But the conversation, I guess the main takeaway here, I'm sorry I'm rambling, is conversation happens in multiple places, and I don't think it hurts in the sense that the goal. Always keep in mind what the objective and the purpose of your community is, and make sure that you're framing and asking, inviting, and curating and acknowledging and rewarding folks that take action towards your collectively agreed objectives. Does that make sense? I hope so, anyway.
Yep.
I know I do.
Makes sense to me, at least. Lauren?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that Joseph has said, and I think that just, along the lines of your community is going to have its activity in a multitude of places. It's not like if you have maybe the equivalent, 50 years ago was like a town meeting. So you're going to have a meeting in your town hall, but that doesn't mean that, a couple of people are not going to talk about the same community issues at church or at the post office. So if all of your interaction is purely on Twitter, then that's going to be a lot harder, because you can't really foster a community on Twitter or Facebook the same way you can where you have sort of a centralized hub. But the conversations that are going to drive drive views back to your actual platform is never a bad thing.
Great. All right. Well, I believe that is all the questions, all the time we have for this evening. So I wanted to thank all of the students who were here this evening. Obviously, this is the last live session for the course. You can see the rest of the recaps on the class page, and I will, of course, have a recap and an article up with this information as well. So thank you again, and a big thank you to our special guests, Joseph and Lauren. Yeah, I really appreciate your time and your experience and insight here. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
Yeah, feel free to reach out to us if anyone has questions. You can follow us on Twitter. I'm Joseph Porcelli, and she's exhilarating.